Hey everyone, this is Theo from Headphones.com, and today I'll be sharing my review of the Tanchjim Tanya and the Hana 2021. These are both single dynamic driver IEMs, with the Tanya clocking in at $25 with the microphone option, and then the Hana 2021 clocking in at, I want to say, $180. If you're not familiar with Tanchjim, they are sort of the maligned older brother of Moondrop. They basically had one really good IEM called the Oxygen that everyone, including myself, really liked, and then their releases after that just sort of fell off the radar. The original Hana and then the Darling that followed that, I was not really a fan of both of those IEMs, and I think the overall reception of them was more middling in general. With that being said, I think that these two IEMs are really going to be worth taking a look at, and if you're asking me, they're sort of going to be that pivoting point for Tanchjim to come back to the forefront. Let's take a look. Alright, so let's quickly go over the build and the comfort of these two IEMs. As usual, I'm not really the person to ask about this stuff, and I am going to be going through it pretty quickly. So in fact, I don't even have the box and the accessories for the Hana 2021 because this is on loan from Super Review. And that's exactly who I would turn to if you're looking for a more in-depth look at the accessories as well as some more sound impressions of these IEMs. So starting with the Tanya, you have a pretty standard bullet IEM design. I personally do not use these very often, but it is a very comfortable design, and I think I can lay on my side with these IEMs. It's pretty darn comfortable. And then there's also an option for a microphone, which I personally went for just because it's only a few dollars more and it's going to give you the option to control playback from your iPhone, which was a big selling point for me just because that's where a lot of my listening gets done off of. I do want to point out that the cable here is non-detachable, but in my opinion, it's a pretty solid cable and you could definitely do a lot worse for this price point. Okay, and then over here we have the Hana 2021, and yes, this is a very blingy IEM. It is definitely a lot more blingy than the original Hana, which I believe was all white. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out in case you're looking for a more discreet look, which is personally what I usually go for, and I do find this to be a little bit over the top for my taste. But overall, the build quality here is pretty exceptional, and I love the fit of these IEMs. You're not going to get the best isolation with the Hana 2021 just because it's a pretty shallow fit, but for comfort, it is definitely up there, and this is one of the few IEMs that I personally can sleep on my side with, or just lay on my side with in general. I think the cable here is pretty nice too. It's definitely well behaved, and it doesn't tangle super easily. It's definitely not nearly as bad as the Moondrop KXXS's cable, which you can see here. Okay, so let's dive into what I care about, which is the actual sound. Starting with the Tanya, you have something that is most closely reminiscent of the Sony MH755. That's that legendary budget IEM that was tuned to the Harman target. So what you have with the Tanya is a pretty V-shaped tuning, but at the same time it is quite balanced. Starting with the bass, you're not going to sort of have that sub-bass emphasis that the MH755 has, and the Tanya has more of a mid-bass emphasis. But if you just want a little bit of fun, a little bit of bass into your music, this is going to suit you just fine. It's obviously not going to match the MH755 when it comes to that sheer slam, that bass texturing, and that sheer extension. But where things start looking up is in the mid-range. One of the 755's biggest weaknesses is the mid-range and the treble regions. The upper mid-range is quite elevated, and then the lower treble as well is quite forward, which results in a very closed-in and somewhat fatiguing presentation over time. So what Tanchjim has done here with the Tanya is really quite remarkable. The pina compensation, the way it's been balanced, it makes it so that vocals, they sort of sit further back in terms of the presentation still. They're a little bit more recessed, but at the same time, they are by no means edgy, and they are by no means sort of like just scooped and cut out. It's a very pleasant vocal presentation on the Tanya. The idea of a more relaxed tuning also applies to the Tanya's treble region. It's still reliant on the lower treble, so around like 5 or 6 kHz, but at the same time, it doesn't have the peak of death that a lot of these cheapo IEMs tend to exhibit. And then after that point, at around 8 kHz, it just starts sloping off. So in general, this is definitely a darker IEM. But at the same time, very, very pleasant, and that's sort of what you would expect for a IEM of this price point. Likewise, I would probably temper your expectations in terms of technical performance. Personally, I would put this at around maybe a C, maybe a C+ if I was feeling generous. Not the most resolving set, and imaging in particular is it's pretty hard to distinguish where instruments are coming from on the stage. That being said, I will note that the soundstage width of this IEM is above average. And if I had to take a guess, that's probably attributable to the more open design of the Tanya and where the drivers are seated. Now, while it might seem like I am harping on this quite a bit, for $25, you're really not going to find many IEMs better than the Tanya, and I'm going to say that this is a major go for me. It's very inoffensive, very well tuned, and for the price point, there really is nothing that matches this for raw tuning in my opinion. Okay, so moving on to the Hana 2021, let's actually talk about the original Hana first. That IEM was quite bass light and was very upper mid-range forward. This resulted in a quite lean presentation, which personally gave me the impression that vocalists were sort of choking and they didn't have enough air. That has changed with this IEM quite a bit. Tanchjim has brought back the bass, and they have also brought down the lower mid-range. So what you effectively have now is a dead ringer for the Oxygen in terms of tuning, as well as the Moondrop single dynamic driver IMs like the Aria, the Starfield, and the KXXS. So as for how this actually sounds, this is pretty reminiscent of the Harman Target. Starting with the bass, you definitely have a little bit more mid-bass, which is going to lend some more warmth to the lower mid-range and keep the transition a little bit smoother. It's not a clean-cut bass shelf, and it's not completely sub-bass oriented like the Harman Target would call for, but at the same time, I do find this quite easy on the ears, and I really have no complaints about it. In terms of the tactility of the bass itself, I would say it's a step up over the Moondrop single dynamic driver IMs, but at the same time, probably not best in class. I think there's stuff like the ICO OH10, which might have just a small edge on the Hana, and then also the ER2XR, which is a little bit more controlled, but doesn't slam as hard or doesn't have as much texture. But yeah, in general, pretty solid bass response, especially for $200. So moving into the mid-range, you definitely have a more upper mid-range oriented tuning, but it is by no means like shouty or excessively thin. And part of the reason for that is just because you have a little bit more energy in that bass shelf in the mid-bass, which is going to lend some more warmth to the low end of this IM with male vocals. Moving into the treble, this is where I think graphs can be a little bit deceiving. Despite the Hana 2021 graphing almost exactly the same as Moondrop single dynamic driver IMs, they really do sound quite different. The Hana 2021 has a little bit more lower treble and mid treble, so percussive hits come across a little bit more forward and a little bit sharper. And I suspect that part of the reason for this is just because the Hana 2021 has better separation. It's better able to sort of space out the hits and so they come across as more forward. As well as this, the Hana 2021 does not have that sort of haziness of treble reverb that the Moondrop single dynamic driver IMs have. It's a lot more consistent and a little bit more extended in the air regions. Okay, and that basically covers the Hana 2021's overall tonal balance. With that being said, you already knew that I was probably going to like it just because it was tuned exactly the same as the Oxygen, and it was very similar to the Moondrop single dynamic driver IMs, which I am already fond of. So as for what I'm really impressed by with the Hana 2021 is its timbre. There is a sort of misconception that I'm probably guilty of perpetuating myself, that when an IM has a dynamic driver, it automatically means that the timbre is going to be good. Unfortunately, this is simply not true, and I've heard my fair share of dynamic driver IMs with poor timbre. I don't want to deal in absolutes here, but the Hana 2021 is definitely up there in terms of pleasantness of timbre. The attack on it is just a little bit sharper than on the KXXS, but at the same time, the decay is a lot more elongated and a little bit smoother. And this just results in a very, very pleasant and natural presentation to notes and the overall timbre of the Hana 2021. The other thing that has me really impressed about the Hana 2021 is its imaging performance. The soundstage is ever so slightly out of head, and especially when it comes to stuff panned to the direct left and the direct right, they sort of float on the soundstage, and there's a little bit of height actually. Now we're still talking for an IM and for the price, but at the same time, I think that this is a pretty commendable quality to the Hana 2021. Dynamics as well are pretty solid on the Hana 2021, and there's a good sense of vividness to the IM. And frankly, the Moondrop single dynamic driver IMs, they sort of come off as a little bit etched by comparison, a little bit too cold to my ears when I'm A-Bing them. In general, I have to say that I'm very impressed with what Tanchjim has managed to do with these two IMs. With the Tanya, I'm going to go out on a limb and just say that you can go blind buy this IM. It's $25, and in my opinion at least, it is one of the most well-tuned IMs at that price point. You really do not have much to lose. And if you're looking for a beater, I'm just going to say go for it. Moving on to the Hana 2021, again, I think that this is a pretty clear-cut recommendation for me. If you're looking for a baby Oxygen, or you're looking for an upgrade to the Moondrop single dynamic driver IMs, then I think this is the ticket. There are still a number of reasons why someone might not want to purchase a Hana 2021, mostly on the basis of subjective preference, but as far as being a reviewer goes and sort of assessing objectively for tonal balance and technical performance, I'm going to go out and say that this is probably one of the best single dynamic driver IMs under $200, and just one of the best IMs under $200 in general. And yeah, I think that's going to do it for this review. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.